Hello, this is Zahirul Alam. Welcome you all on Frankly Speaking. My guest today is Dr. Kan Chuan, Director, the Union. Dr. Kan Chuan is focused on tobacco control at the Union. His office works closely with public health programs in many areas, nationally and internationally, with many development partners, with many donors. But Dr. Kan Chuan especially related to tobacco control. He completed his PhD in public health and a postdoc on tobacco control research since 2009. Earlier, Dr. Kan Chuan had managed China's Bloomberg Initiative tobacco control grants. He developed campaigns and conducted many policy research. He became director of the Union in 2007 and looks after the tobacco control around the world from the Union. He is now visiting Dhaka, and we welcome Dr. Kan Chuan on Frankly Speaking. Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. Dr. Kan Chuan, thousands of people are dying every year using tobacco, and this is a major cause of many deaths and disease around the world, and a horrific situation is prevailing all around the world, especially in the developing nations. So, I mean, in your view, what is the current situation? How do you evaluate the tobacco use around the world?
I think it's very true. Every year, around 7 million people are dying from tobacco use around the world. And the developing countries, such as Bangladesh, is really sharing the majority of the burden from tobacco use. And we have to say, since 2005, ever since the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control was in place, quite a lot of progress has been made in tobacco control. However, we have to be aware this is not enough. We have to do a lot more to really get the work done.
What are the programs you look after the tobacco control area from Union? What are the programs you have taken so far with Bangladesh?
I think in Bangladesh, basically like in many other countries, we are trying to implement the best practice tobacco control measures. Best practice tobacco control measures are WHO recommended, and they are called Empower, which include a set of tobacco control implementable tobacco control policies, such as raising tobacco tax, to make tobacco products more expensive so that people cannot afford, and it will cut down on smoking or quit. We have to ban tobacco advertising so that kids can stay away from the attraction of tobacco products. We have to ban smoking in public places. We should help people quit smoking. So these are the measures we have been trying to implement around the world as well as in Bangladesh.
So, I mean, you believe that raising tobacco tax is one of the key instruments?
I think raising tobacco tax is the most effective.
Not one of the.
The most effective measures to cut down smoking, especially for the youth, because we know children don't have a lot of money to spare. So making tobacco products more expensive is really the most effective measures to make children stay away from smoking.
But I mean, what you were seeing when you were, you were observing the situation in Bangladesh, is there any remarkable or significant increase of tobacco tax?
I think I have to say quite a commendable effort has been made in raising tobacco tax in the past 10 years. However, we have to be aware tobacco products are still quite cheap here in Bangladesh. People can still afford tobacco products. So I think there's still a long way to go to achieve the recommended level of tobacco tax by WHO.
What are the roadblocks? what are the roadblocks in raising tobacco tax actually? Is that the pursuing the policymakers properly? Is there any lack of effort to that, or the dearth of goodwill from the policymakers to raise tobacco taxes, or any intriguing efforts from the the parties concerned, like tobacco industry?
Absolutely, absolutely. I think these policies have to be put in place by policymakers. Like you said, we have a strong opponent, which is the tobacco industry. This makes tobacco control very different from any other public health programs. We have an enemy, a very strong enemy, who is doing...
The tobacco has got the only giant enemy, right?
Exactly. Not like tuberculosis.
Diabetes, no enemy.
Malaria.
Yeah.
But for tobacco, we have a very rich enemy who has all the resources in the world.
Okay.
They can move around to fight against us. And they know tobacco taxation is the most important, the most effective measure in tobacco control. So they are trying everything they can to stop tobacco taxes from being raised.
So what are the global experience in this regard? I mean, the restricting the tobacco industry's influence into into their maneuvering.
I think there are two aspects. One aspect is really to put in place policy to make sure government officials won't be interfered by tobacco industry.
Yeah.
So whatever tobacco control policy we're discussing, we're reviewing, we're trying to pass, it should be shielded from the interference from tobacco industry. That's one thing. I think the second thing is really, we know the tobacco industry has been, I have to say, cheating the public about the harms of tobacco smoking. It's really trying to hook up the children into smoking.
No denying with that they are cheating the public, the users, tobacco users. But on the other hand, how do you see the degree of effort of awareing people against this menacing effort or menacing consequences of tobacco use?
I think we have not done enough to make sure people are aware. First, tobacco smoking is very bad for health. Second, tobacco industry is really the culprit in this global tobacco use epidemic. So I think that's the second thing I was going to talk about, which is tobacco industry has to be responsible for the epidemic they have caused. They have to pay for the deaths. They have to pay for the healthcare costs that's being caused by tobacco smoking.
So, I mean, how they can compensate? I mean, how they can be made accountable?
Many countries in the world have made the tobacco industry to pay for the health costs.
Development surcharge or...
Exactly. Development surcharge, which is being discussed in Bangladesh.
We have in Bangladesh 1% development surcharge.
Yeah, it's being discussed. I mean, people we've been talking to in the past few days have been very hopeful that this will be put in place very soon. This will be a significant boost to the tobacco control program.
Dr. Kanchun, we discussed about the tobacco tax and tobacco industry's accountability. And what are the other tools, what are the other instruments which can be effective in restricting tobacco use around the developing nations, including Bangladesh?
I think
like graphical health warning is one of the...
Exactly. Graphical health warning, we know in Bangladesh the size of the graphic health warning on cigarette packs is around half.
Yes, yeah.
50%.
Lower part of the cigarette pack.
And it's going to be put on the upper part.
Yeah. And this is a result of a legal battle.
Exactly. However, the best practice around the world is really to have a generic, plain packaging, which is going to remove all the appealing features of the tobacco branding.
Okay.
Every tobacco brand is going to have the same font, same color, besides very large graphic health warnings. Such measures have been put in place by countries like Australia, UK, France, and a few other countries. So I think it's really time for every country, including Bangladesh, to catch up and to implement this very effective measure.
In your view, well, which countries have made much remarkable progresses so far in the good practices related to tobacco use?
Quite a few countries have made very impressive progress. I think the leading nation is probably Australia. Australia has been the first country to implement graphic health warning.
Almost 80–90%,
Over 80%.
Over 80%.
Over 80%. It's called plain packaging.
Okay.
Besides that, in Australia, you cannot smoke in public places. You cannot see tobacco advertising.
I mean, by law, it happens in Bangladesh too, but I mean, the question around with implementing the law.
Yeah. That's the challenge in Bangladesh, as well as in many other developing countries. We have good laws, but we don't have very effective implementation, which makes the law sometimes not as effective.
Do you find any double standard in implementing the FCTC? I mean, the commitment of the member countries. Double standard means that if you find that the government of particular country have got some good degree of share with the tobacco industry, and they also enacted the law in compliance with the global instruments.
That's a conflict of interest, isn't it?
Yeah.
Right? We have to make all the governments to stay away from the profits they will gain from the tobacco companies, because that's a conflict of interest.
Yeah.
You are making money from working with tobacco companies. How can we be convinced you are going to be dedicated in tobacco control, which is the case in Bangladesh? We know the government has a quite large share in the tobacco companies. And we know some of the government senior members are sitting on the board of the tobacco company. This is a serious conflict of interest. In order to make sure the government is going to be wholly dedicated in tobacco control, I think such situation of conflict of interest needs to be changed.
But real scenario in Bangladesh, what is very encouraging for many of us, that Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina, she has announced that Bangladesh will be a tobacco-free country by 2040. That's a big boost for the anti-tobacco campaign, and hopefully this will produce bring about some good and positive great success in anti-tobacco campaign. What do you think?
I think everybody feels so encouraged by this very ambitious goal set by the Prime Minister of Bangladesh. In order to achieve this very grand goal, we have to put in place very effective measures of tobacco control. We talked about raising tobacco tax. We talked about enlarging the health warnings on cigarette packs. And we talked about making sure the tobacco control program is going to be sustainable by dedicating the health development surcharge in tobacco control. And we talked about implementing effectively, enforcing tobacco control laws. I think all these measures have to be put in place in order to achieve this very ambitious goal.
Tell us something about the why. I mean, definitely this is a major cause of many deaths and disease. But why you are focusing so much on tobacco control? Why it is so critically important for the nations, for the global community?
I think there are two reasons. The first reason is simply tobacco use is the #1 preventable risk factor around the world. 7 million people die every year from tobacco use, and no other public health program has such a big problem. That's number one. Second, I think tobacco control is different from the other public health programs, which is that we have enemy, which makes tobacco control not just a public health program problem. It's really a social justice problem, which needs to be corrected.
How do you define the social justice problem?
Because the tobacco industry, for instance, in many countries, we know the smoking rate among women is much lower than among men. And the tobacco industry is really using every promotional tactics to raise the smoking rate among women. And this is a very deceitful tactic.
Okay.
This is a social justice problem, and we need to correct it.
Dr. Can Chun, we have been discussing sustainable development goals, and definitely this is closely linked with developing public health and giving due importance on public health issues. So how do you relate with the tobacco control issue in line with the SDGs, which have been framed by the global leaders?
I think one of the tobacco control is clearly outlined in SDGs, which is that we have to implement the framework convention on tobacco control. And the other thing I want to mention is really to achieve sustainable development, we have to make sure the tobacco control program is well funded. At the moment, most of the tobacco control programs around the world, including Bangladesh, is being funded by international donors, philanthropies.
Right.
However, to make these programs sustainable, we have to make sure that the local governments, the domestic governments, are funding these programs. And there's a consensus around the world.
Yeah.
Tobacco taxation is probably the best source of funding for this. So I'm really glad to see the health development surcharge in Bangladesh. And I'll be very, very encouraged if this policy will be well implemented.
How the authority can make best use of this development surcharge?
To make sure these development surcharge will be used in preventive measures. Many countries use these development surcharge into healthcare. However, we know the most effective use of this money is really to use it in prevention. And tobacco use is really the most #1 preventable risk factor. To put into preventable risk factors, that's the best way.
There are some intriguing efforts by the tobacco industry. Definitely, you mentioned about the tobacco advertising, promotions, and sales. Now, how to deal with because in our law, so tobacco advertising, promotion, these are all banned by law. But somehow or other, they are resorting to that practices, using maneuvering with the tabs. So how to restrict, how to deal with it?
I think #1, just like any other tobacco control policies, we have to make sure the ban on tobacco advertising, promotion, and sponsorship will be well implemented. We have to put in place monitoring mechanism, and we have to put in place a mechanism that makes sure the government agency who is going to implement the advertising ban will be responsible. The enforcement agencies will be responsible. The tax ban should be strictly enforced. That's really key to make sure that children will not see tobacco advertising.
What's your personal motivation in working in this field particularly?
I think...
why you think it's most important for you to work with tobacco control?
7 million people are dying every year around the world from tobacco use. And the culprit is really the tobacco company. It's not a disease. It's a human-made crisis. which is to be corrected. If you think about, it's really the company that's responsible. It makes me feel angry. We need to correct this problem.
But recently, I think you were very much aware about the Reuters report and the Guardian's report that in some countries, the tobacco industry is funding international labor organizations and eliminating child labor in cultivation. So, I mean, why these things exposed so late? I mean, or the global community or governments are not, do you think, aware about the intriguing practices or maneuvering by the tobacco industry? These realities are coming up right now. Why?
I think we have been trying to expose the tobacco industry's behaviors for many, many years. Of course, we need to do more. We need to let people know the tactics of the tobacco industry. But on the other side, we need to make sure the governments have to stay away from the tobacco industry. We need to put in place policies, measures to make sure government officials will not engage in illegal, unlawful interactions with the tobacco industry. That's very important.
Do you believe that tobacco cultivation could jeopardize the food security in the coming years for many nations?
I think it's already jeopardizing the food source in many nations. Tobacco cultivation is not just bad for food source, it's bad for the environment, it's bad for the livelihood of the tobacco farmers. It's really something we need to look at very, very seriously. We need to diversify the tobacco farmers. And actually, tobacco farming is not very profitable. There are many, many more profitable sources of engagement in agriculture rather than.
But we're failing to give that alternatives to the farmers yet.
We haven't done enough.
Yeah.
We haven't done enough.
Yes, but as a staunch advocate in the field of tobacco control, representing the union, what is your last message to aware people, to make them more enthusiastic about standing by the fighting tobacco control?
I think we are not just fighting against the tobacco-caused diseases. We are fighting against a tobacco industry, an evil company, which is our enemy.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kanchuan, for joining me on Frankly Speaking. Dear viewers, that's my conversation with Dr. Kanchuan, Director of the Union. Thank you for watching our show, and we invite you to watch our next episode. Until then, take care. Goodbye.